I can see some uses of nuclear warheads for asteroid deflection and stuff like that, but generally having arsenals pointed at each other, no, that is not a good state to be in, because sooner or later there is going to be a mistake. When I get asked the question, what is the probability of humanity going extinct this century, I typically hand wave a bit and say maybe something around 10% chance.
Patrick, maybe we should have we should always press the record button directly,
Yeah.
So we can talk about, the weird lightning and the saint, Anders the Saint, and...
Yeah, it's the unscripted parts that are quite often much more interesting. So the BBC usually asks as a sound check, what did you have for breakfast? And I always wanted to have a collection of recordings where all the famous and infamous people of the world have been talking about, I had some breakfast cereal before going off to that fateful cabinet meeting, or before declaring that war, I had a lovely full British breakfast.
I feel that in particular when you turn off the camera and the lights and people take a breath out, they exhale, and then they actually start becoming well formulated and, that's exactly how I should put that point, and so on.
There is that wonderful French expression, l'esprit d'escalier, the esprit of a staircase, and it always is so good when you're walking away. Now you know that witty thing to go back on.
It's a wonderful feeling when you've been working on something and then all of a sudden you get an extra day, or you get to reconsider it for some reason. And all of a sudden it's like you become a different person looking at your old work.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the decompression. Normally we work under a lot of constraints, quite often time constraints. And when you suddenly remove the time constraints, not necessarily indefinitely, but just, I had an extra hour, I forgot about the time zones. Suddenly you take a step back, you relax, you see the creative possibilities.
Exactly. So maybe, there's the academic quarter, but there should be a deadline, but there should be a secret deadline. That's a little bit later.
So all the lectures have this random timer, and then it starts a little bit later. I found when I'm giving lectures, typically, as soon as I open my mouth to start talking, somebody arrives a bit late. So I've started trying to add a bit of padding to the opening, but the universe is smarter than me. It knows that is padding, so as soon as I get to the actual content, that's where the late person arrives. So I just need to keep on padding things indefinitely, then I can make the entire audience show up at the last sentence.
I work as a technology reporter when I'm not doing podcasting. And so I always manage to figure out the secret deadlines. So you can't fool me. If there's a secret deadline, I'll know about it, and then I'll push up against that one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have a bunch of editors trying to claim that their secret deadlines are due for my various papers and books, but no, I see through them.
So, Anders Sandberg is a Swedish philosopher and researcher working at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. He was the senior research fellow at the renowned Future of Humanities Institute at the University of Oxford. I was teaching a class about the philosophy of technology, and I used many of their publications in my teaching. I found them very useful. His focus is on issues of the very long-term future and technologies that can change the human condition. And he has many other specialties, I think we shall find out. Anders Sandberg, welcome to Levity.
Thank you. This is going to be fun.
Today I was perusing what was formerly known as Twitter, the X. And there was some good news. David Sinclair said that we don't have to exercise too hard, but we should exercise a bit. And we can gain 5 years in a life expectancy. That's quite good.
He's always the rabble-rouser.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of rabble-rousing when you tell people what they want to hear. And to some degree, people don't get as riled up by that as when somebody says, I only have blood, sweat and tears to give you. So I think people would probably listen even more if it said, oh no, we need to exercise like insane to do things. But I read that and felt like, okay, I roughly believed this. Good to see some more support. Oh dear, I believe in this because I already believed it. Maybe I didn't update enough.
I think one can feel it in one's own life too. When one goes too hard, there is some chance you feel some ache in your body. You can feel when it's a bit too much of a good thing. And
but you know what? This I have to say, if we're going to talk about exercise now, this was exactly the thing that I didn't want to hear. You know why? Because when we're talking about diet, everyone has their own opinion and nothing can really agree on anything. And you know, exercise is this like holy place for me where scientists finally agree on something. They universally agree. And then David Sinclair comes and says, yeah, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't exercise too hard. And I'm like, oh no.
But exercise is still good for a lot of other stuff. It keeps you healthy and it keeps you happy. That's already a good reason to do it.
Well, this is already becoming a tangent, because my real point was that I also today looked at the doomsday clock, because it's the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They have this clock that counts down to extinction. The closer we are to midnight, the closer we are to extinction. Midnight symbolizes extinction, of course. And so we are 90 seconds, at least we were last year. And so they will, the 28th of January, they're coming out with a new estimate. And so that made me think, of course, okay, it's great that we exercise a bit so we can live a bit longer, but we can't survive a nuclear disaster or Armageddon. The question, just to put it very straightforwardly, what are the chances that we will survive the next century and the next 1,000 years and the next 10,000 years?
So
do you think?
I'm rather optimistic. So that doomsday clock is of course about the concern. It's not an actual time measure, and it's kind of painted itself into a corner because it's very hard to estimate. But when I get asked the question, what is the probability of humanity going extinct this century, I typically hand wave a bit and say maybe something around 10% chance. So many people hear that and say, oh no, that's enormous, this is so gloomy. And I cheerfully say, yeah, but it's 90% chance that we muddle through. Now, one can quibble a little bit about how big the number should be. I sometimes say 12% because I think there is some risk of just a dystopian thing that made us wish we were extinct. My friend and colleague Toby Ord, in his book The Precipice, he's making a long argument for that it's about 1 in 6. And you can, of course, really argue, what kind of probability is this? How do you even put a number on it? Does that make sense? If we look at longer time periods, what about 1,000 years? I think, again, I would give maybe a little bit higher probability over 1,000 years. Let's say maybe 12 or 15%, but not much. I think this might be the crunch time where we're young and immature and badly unable to control many of the rather powerful technologies we're getting. But if we get through that, I think we actually have a fairly long future. And indeed, if we survive the next 1,000 years, I think the next 1,000,000 years are going to be a breeze.
I see. So we are in a particularly vulnerable time now because we have created many more ways to destroy ourselves. Is that the idea?
That is the idea. And this is by no means uncontroversial. In the past, of course, humanity was a much smaller species where few people in a few locations, so a disaster there could have killed us all. But now we're on every continent and we're adapted to almost every ecosystem on the planet. And we're very good at handling the local disasters fairly well. It's just that now we also have gotten the power to create global disasters. We developed the ability to make global warfare. We developed biotechnologies that enable us to do biological warfare. We developed nuclear weapons, and we might be on the verge of developing really powerful and transformative AI, which might really get out of hand, and so on. So most of the really big threats seems to be coming from humanity. the good news here is, it's we who are the problem. We can probably switch this by doing something different. It's actually under human control. Except that sometimes it feels like human control, oh no, that is way harder. Deflecting asteroids, no problem. Just send the right spacecraft to them and detonate a nuke or something. That's a technical problem. Getting people to agree on climate change, oh no, that is so much harder work. And agreeing on handling artificial intelligence safety, oh dear. So there is a bit of a paradox that it's human-made and in some sense because of human control, but we're not very much in control.
So this time right now is one of the most dangerous, from the point of view of the species, is one of the most dangerous times.
It could be. And there are some people saying, look, every part of history have been saying that we are at the hinge of history. This is the new era. We are very, very special living right now. And of course, if everybody says that, there's probably nobody that is at the crucial time. But I think it actually is true. We're both getting close to various planetary boundaries. We're also changing our infrastructure more rapidly than ever to actually handle those issues, like decarbonizing the economy. We're getting a global society with a global economy, and then we're putting in all sorts of very powerful technologies at the same time. So this might very well be crunch time. I'm hoping in 1,000 years we're sitting here and doing a follow-up podcast and laughing at how naive we were back there in the 21st century. But I do think that there's a pretty high likelihood that this is a bit of a crunch time.
I mean, amen to us sitting here in 1,000 years. I mean, we are the true longevity podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, existence is exactly what we like to have a lot of.
And just imagine the retrospectives one can do over time. So it's the 500th anniversary now on this and that important event. And of course, we shouldn't forget it's the 10,000th anniversary of that other big thing.
Lots to celebrate.
Yeah, hopefully. And that is, of course, one reason I think we want to have a future as a species. There are triumphs and good things humans have created. Unfortunately, I think many people find that, dissing humanity, that makes you sound world-weary and wise. But I think it's kind of just a bad form of cynicism. We should actually applaud what we have achieved and then, okay, we have done horrific and embarrassing things. Let's figure out ways of never doing that again. And indeed, if you look at the life projects we have, many of them only make sense if we think that there is going to be future generations looking back on them and saying, oh, it was wonderful that they made this garden or built this building or composed that symphony.
I think there is a cultural prejudice that if you express optimism, you're regarded as naive. And if you express pessimism, you're regarded as wise.
Yeah, and I think that is partially because evolution has made us very nervous about risk, because it only takes one accident and you're dead. But that means that you need to avoid accidents much more than you need to grab good opportunities. It's just that we as intelligent beings are rather good at making opportunities for ourselves.
So are you an outlier when it comes to saying that we have a 10% chance of not making it out of this century? What is the general feeling among people who study this, like people, your colleagues at the Future of Humanity Institute and the Institute for Future Studies?
So around here in Oxford, among us doing X-risk research, we tend to think 10%, that's kind of a ballpark, especially when you talk about artificial intelligence risk, which might just merely include the end of civilization because of something AI related. There is almost a running joke around Silicon Valley that what is your P-doom? And 10% is kind of a middle of the road position by us who can't really decide. But at the same time, if you're trying to be serious about estimating the risk, it's tricky. Super forecasters, people who are unusually good at forecasting things in tournaments, so we find the people who are actually quite good because they empirically are good at it, they tend to give lower numbers. So they end up with maybe 5% or 2%. Which for me is, I don't care. It's still way too much probability of a really big risk. One wouldn't accept getting onto an airplane if one knew that, it's a 2% risk that it's going to crash during this flight. I would only get on board if I really, really needed to get somewhere. I would be pretty desperate.
We don't have a choice, though. We are in the plane.
We kind of woken up on the airplane and are just listening to the most dreadful airplane safety briefing ever. And in the case of nuclear war, please duck and cover.
If you know that super forecasters say 5%, why do you say 10%?
They are wrong about this. And this is kind of an interesting claim for me because I'm not a super forecaster. But super forecasters generally prove their worth by making predictions that we find out that were true, or making predictions that I'm 80% certain about this happening, and then we find that those 80% certain things happen roughly 80% of the time. So they're well calibrated. But this typically requires a lot of feedback. And this is the annoying thing about the future. You have to wait for the feedback from the future. So there are some forms of feedback that we get fairly rapidly. If I try to predict next week's sport results, I'm going to get the result within a week. If I talk about elections and whether it's going to be a war breaking out in a different place, well, yeah, but it's going to take a few months to a few years. And over that time span, super forecasters tend to be good. It seems that they become less reliable over the long timescales, mostly because we don't get that much feedback. This is the area where theory starts playing a role. So Philip Tetlock did a classic study. He's actually partially behind the whole idea of super forecasting, but he looked at policy experts in Washington making confident predictions about where the world was going. And he noticed that, yeah, they're really bad at it, despite being very, very confident. But some of them, he called the hedgehogs from Isaiah Berlin, that said, yeah, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one. And that one big truth is kind of their big theory. And they're much worse than the foxes, who combine lots of pieces of evidence, lots of theories, and patch them together. But of course, when a hedgehog thinker is right, you invite him to the television studio and he's going to give a very confident explanation of why his particular interpretation of Marxism or the environmental studies or whatever explain what happened. Meanwhile, the fox is going to sit there and say, yeah, I read these things in the newspaper, and then I heard a lot of stuff on Twitter, and then I update a bit, and then I ran a simulation too, and then I estimated this combination. But I'm very much more of a fox thinker. But the further you go into the future, the more you have to be a bit of a hedgehog. You need to use theories. So we know fairly well, for example, that, yeah, this current interglacial is going to end and the ice age is going to return. Why? We have strong empirical evidence, we have climate models, we have good theories. It's not like anybody has good experience with the ends of ice ages, or at least those people are kind of long dead since now. So when I look at these risks, I need to kind of estimate that, okay, what's the probability that a random computer program that is super intelligent is also risky to humans? Can we estimate whether that is a low or high probability? What about the safeguards? What are their likelihood? So I end up with different estimates. Now, this is still a big bone of contention. There are many researchers saying that, look, all you guys are way too gloomy. Actually, the risk is much, much smaller. Some of them are also gloomy and saying, oh no, the pain will go on, actually. There is no relief. There are some doomsters that actually really hoped that a giant asteroid would hit us. But most people think that, it's just going to keep on being normal, right? But the problem is the world has not been normal for quite a while now.
These are difficult days to know things, I mean, for many reasons. I mean, one reason is that few of us can grasp the theories and the facts because they are so deep now. And so we have to, in some sense, substitute our own experience of the world with who we trust the most.
And that's, of course, a real headache because, okay, how do I know who to trust? Well, there are other trustworthy people telling me who to trust, but how do I know to trust them? Sometimes you can check. I was talking about track records. That's a great way of testing some things. But it only works for some things. When it comes to philosophy, okay, people make a compelling argument, but maybe I just got taken in by the great philosopher's charisma there, or a great literary style. Maybe it's actually a bad argument. Maybe I can listen to the other philosophers, but they're bound to disagree with that philosopher because that's their job. It's complicated, and also the market of opinions is much bigger.
The rational thing would be to say, well, I know that I think this now, but it can be defeated when I learn more. Epistemic
humility, the kind of fancy term for it, I think it's very useful not to hold your beliefs too strongly. Being absolutely certain of anything is kind of stupid. At the same time, we need to act on our beliefs, but we can recognize that I could be wrong about this, but I'm still gonna do it.
I think you're making a point there that it can sap your motivation, perhaps, to have that epistemic humility too much. You can say that the only thing I know is that I heard that someone said this. Sandberg said 10%, the super forecaster said 5%. I'm Patrick Linden. That's all I know. I know that. I know that I heard that. No, I'm reasonably certain that I heard that.
If we're not careful, we get back to old Cratylus, the Greek cynic, who only raised his finger whenever he heard something to indicate that something happened, but he was not certain what it was. So.
I mean, I think generally, though, the problem is that people are too sure about themselves, and they take their own certainty as evidence for the veracity of whatever belief they have. That's probably what needs to be corrected more, perhaps, than humility.
You want to control your humility level, because being right all the time is not necessarily the best thing, because you need to do stuff too. If I smell smoke, maybe there is a fire, maybe not. And even if I think it's a low probability, it's probably a good idea for looking for it and maybe even leaving the building. Maybe I'm being a bit too cautious. But given that my life is very precious to me, losing it would be rather bad. So in that case, the uncertainty doesn't mean that I'm just sitting here and ignoring stuff. And I think this is the tricky part, because trying to be right about everything, that is especially what science is trying to do. But in many cases, what we're right about are uninteresting facts. We want to discover facts that are matter to people's lives, that matter to us being able to affect the world in a positive way. And in that case, it might sometimes mean that we need to gamble on things. The most extreme part is, of course, entrepreneurs. They need to start believing in the idea to a ridiculous degree. They need to be almost insane in confidence in that this is going to be the greatest thing ever in order to actually run the company and build their innovation and try it. And if they had the proper humility, they would probably realize that, yeah, if I succeed, it's probably going to be mostly a matter of dumb luck. But that's not going to motivate you or the people you bring with you on the project. So you actually need to stop being humble in order to do something. And then maybe when it goes bankrupt, okay, it's time for humility again before you start your next startup.
I mean, it just reminds me of a classic discussion, I think William James and Clifford, on the ethics of belief in the 19th century. And I think James said, sometimes believing that something is true makes it more likely that it is true. Like the entrepreneur you talk, or that somebody loves you, or some things like that some values can be lost if you're too much of a stickler.
Oh yeah, and being an optimist, I quite often say that as an optimist, that a pessimist might be right more often than optimist, but we're still happy when we're wrong. The pessimist is right and not happy about it. And the best thing about being an optimist is kind of, okay, you get out of bed in the morning thinking, okay, we can fix this.
How would you rate the greatest risks?
So,
what are you most worried about?
So there is that kind of oldie but a goodie nuclear war. In some sense, it was the original anthropogenic existential risk. Back there in 1945, people immediately realized that this weapon changes the game, and this looks like it could be scaled up to end the world. And indeed, people started immediately working very hard on scaling the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb and beyond that. Now, I grew up in the 80s, so for me nuclear war is kind of a normal state. I remember going to bed thinking that the missiles might be in the air tonight, and indeed later on we found out about a lot of close calls and near misses where various technical mishaps almost led to a nuclear exchange. So that was definitely a real risk back then. And then came a bit of a shock in the early 90s. Suddenly the Berlin Wall fell down, and we're all breathing a sigh of relief, and everybody forgot about the missiles. They're still standing in the silos. Yeah, perhaps less likely that somebody would have an obvious reason to fire them, but the satellite warning systems are still as rickety. There is still a lot of software made by the lowest bidder, etc. And of course, recent events, for example, the Ukraine war, have increased the risk. Indeed, when it broke out, I was kind of humming various pop hits from the 80s while I was walking around in our offices. After all the pop music in the 80s had something about nuclear war. And while the younger researchers were kind of rediscovering the fear that came from that, and were starting to think, do I need to go on holiday far away from any primary target? So nuclear war, I think, is still the big one right now. There are other risks that are kind of increasing, but this one is kind of ongoing and something we need to be concerned about.
Anders, isn't Forever Young, the song Forever Young, about nuclear
Yes,
war?
indeed. You can guess what I was whistling in the hallways. And yeah, the young researcher didn't really like it. So then I switched to 99 Luftballons and so on. Yeah. There was a surprisingly large number of pop songs you could switch between. But Forever Young, I think, is the catchiest.
I'm thinking about Two Tribes Go to War.
Right.
Yeah. So the interesting part about nuclear war is that we understand the kind of physics of it rather well. We have, unfortunately, far too good understanding of what it would do to the areas affected. And then there is this interesting debate about nuclear winters, which started in the 80s, and then after the Iraq war and people started relaxing about nuclear war, people decided, it's probably not a thing. But they misread the data from the burning oil fields in Iraq. It turns out that the dust only got into the troposphere. It was not good evidence for the nuclear winter question. But it still remains a deep uncertainty. We don't know really how bad a nuclear winter would be. It might be minor. It looks like it could be major. But it depends a lot on stuff in your simulations that you can't tell without actually testing it out on an actual city, which probably the ethics board will have complaints about.
The movement to abolish nuclear weapons, it lost steam. It's quite worrisome. I think there's like 9 countries now with nuclear weapons, right? Something like that.
And the problem was, after the Second World War, having a bipolar world with 2 nuclear-armed powers, deterrence kind of works. People were working out the game theory at Rand Corporation and whatever the counterpart in Russia was. And it makes sense. You don't want to get killed, so you threaten to kill your enemy, and then you get a stable situation. And to be honest, it mostly worked. But it assumes that you're a rational agent, and that it's a simple situation. If you get 3 powers, you can manage it. 4 powers, well, as long as they're not involved in each other's business too much. 7 powers, now it's starting to get slightly complicated. And if you get more proliferation, you get more points of failure. Sure, maybe a little local nuclear war between 2 minor nations only devastates a part of the world, but even there, getting dust into the stratosphere might be very bad. So I'm on the board for a non-profit called AllFed, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters. And we're kind of interested in resilient food. What do we do if the sky turns dark and we can't do agriculture for a lot of years? So we're looking at alternative food sources and figuring out that part at least. And one of the problems might be that instead of nuclear winters, you could get a nuclear autumn. You have a local nuclear exchange, horrifying, devastating in one part of the world, but the rest of the world get bad harvests for a few years. That's going to destabilize a lot of other countries that are already kind of close to the margin. So, yeah, reducing the risk of nuclear war would be a very, very good thing.
So, are you on the side of saying, okay, as soon as we can, we need to get rid of nuclear weapons?
I can see some uses of nuclear warheads for asteroid deflection and stuff like that, but generally having arsenals pointed at each other, no, that is not a good state to be in, because sooner or later there is going to be a mistake. So my office at FHI used to be the Petrov room, named after Stanislav Petrov, who the 26th of September in 1983 saved the world by not following procedure when the alarms went off and it looked like Ronald Reagan had launched a preemptive nuclear attack. It was a computer error, or a satellite error actually, about reflection of light, the lunar light on the Pacific or something like that. And he did the right choice, which was bad for his career, but good for the world. And yeah, I will feel much safer if we knew that we had those the devices very much more under lock and key. The problem is, of course, nuclear weapons are big, expensive stuff that only a few powers can get. And many of the more scary things are small things that are much easier to brew up in your local lab.
Yeah, I mean, so in some sense, the argument in favor of having them is that there's this balance of terror, that it's almost like you're flying on very high altitude and everyone has a gun, but everybody knows if I shoot, it might damage the plane, and we all die. So no one's going to shoot. But the more people have the gun, there can be accidents and so on. But so in a sense, should we say, okay, since nuclear weapons are an existential or near existential threat, I mean, either we wipe ourselves out or we, kick ourselves back to a Stone Age or something like that. We can lose a lot. We can retard the whole kind of progress of humanity by this. So even if there are fewer wars when we have this threat, assuming their hypothesis is true, it's still worth it. It's better that we take a risk of suffering a few more conventional conflicts or so on, where we still don't have the whole humanity at stake.
Yeah, and this of course gets to a really interesting deep philosophical question. What are we trying to achieve here? So if you say we want to save as many human lives as possible, then it might mean that, yeah, if you don't have nuclear weapons, there are more conventional warfare, more human lives are typically lost per year. But if there is a nuclear war, there are no human lives ever. And generally, I think if you just count human lives, in that case, the entire future, there is a lot of lives at stake there. So I think that kind of calculation would say, actually, the nuclear weapons are still worse. Now, if the probability of them ever being misused was zero, in that case, this would not be true. But that cannot actually happen in reality, I think. And if we had systems that were that reliable, we could use them to make the world a better place in a lot of other ways. There is still a lot of tricky things here about how do you create world orders that are livable. You can imagine a stable world order that is still horrible to live in, but humans can survive. So we might also want to know what is the life quality of future generations. If we have an eternal dictatorship that's very stable and will never die out, but everybody really don't like it, in that case, that future has lost so much of the wonderful potential that it could have. So we might still say, yeah, that's existentially dreadful. It's a bit better than being extinct, but not by much. After all, what we want is an open-ended future that is generally acceptable for everybody to go into.
Anders, you alluded to it here, but can you elaborate on that? You alluded to biological risk. I mean, there's the case that you said that nuclear weapons is kind of hard to build. It takes a lot. But the biological weapon could be easy to build for maybe a single person to spread a virus across the world. So how do you think about that and the capabilities that are emerging now?
Yeah, so it's interesting to note that the resources you need to make a pandemic virus are very modest compared to the resources needed to make even a single nuclear warhead. And of course, there are many labs and many people with the necessary skills and equipment to do it. And of course, most people are decent, so most people don't do it. But the more people who can do something, the more likely it is that somebody might be that person. This is incidentally why you want fewer nuclear powers, because in that metaphor with the airplane, if every passenger is armed, the likelihood of one of them being nervous or confused or not handling the gun right is kind of high. So when it comes to biological warfare, people have tried it in the past with very mixed success. It's actually a very tough weapon to direct. And if you ask most admirals and generals, they would say, yeah, we don't really have much use of it because it doesn't fulfill our military objectives. There are some forms of biological warfare, like anthrax spores, that might be useful because you make the enemy sick, but it's not infectious. So then you can go in and defeat them. So in fact, the normal military people are not interested. There are the people who are thinking strategically, saying, okay, my country can't get nuclear weapons because we don't have the resources. But if we have some horrific diseases hidden away, we can say that if you invade us, we're going to drop these test tubes and let them loose. That might still be a credible deterrent. And at least they might think so, but whether that works, that nobody knows. The really scary thing is, of course, when you get the school shooter person and thinks that, oh, instead of shooting up my school, what if I instead unleashed the plague? Now, most school shooters, fortunately, are not very good at biotech. But there is this interval where you have some kind of really misanthropic person and also a bit of technical skill. Usually they don't overlap. There is not that many people. But biotechnology is getting better and better and more accessible. And this is a good thing in general. We're living in this wonderful era where we're actually seeing this enormous openness of biotechnology. People are sequencing genes all over the world. People are building PCR machines out of scrap. We're seeing a lot of wonderful student projects. This is great. It's going to help us find solutions for many problems. And indeed, having a lot of local biologists and biotechnologists might help us fix many of the risks from biology. Just like having a lot of computer people means that we have lots of people can help us against computer viruses and ransomware. But the problem is some of those are perhaps going to be that guy. And the probability of somebody unleashing something bad, either because of maliciousness or sheer stupidity, that increases with time. So we need ways of handling that, but it's a very different thing from the nuclear war case, because here the threat is not so much from a big exchange as somebody unleashing something really bad. And again, experts really disagree on how hard this could be. So there are some people who are very confident that no, tacit knowledge in the lab is really important and amateurs can't possibly do stuff like that. Others like me point out lab automation is getting really easy. I could ask ChatGPT and Claude about various things and get help for the lab. And yeah, right now it's not much better than searching on Google, but it's getting rapidly better. I might be able to download things and feed it into my DNA synthesizer. I have other colleagues poo-pooing this whole idea and say, no, it's the testing stupid and your risk pipeline is the wrong model. So we're having a rather lively exchange about this. It's quite fun.
This episode of Levity is brought to you by Vitalism Foundation.
Vitalism Foundation is a non-profit with a revolutionary mission to achieve unlimited lifespans in peak health.
You should really join us. Follow the link in the description below.
When it comes to the nuclear threat and compared to the biological threat, as you said, there's the case that the biological threat can come in a very decentralized way, and more and more people who are amateurs can have access to the power of putting chemicals together and biological forms together. But it's harder to build an atomic weapon still. And also the solution then to this risk mitigation might look differently as well.
Yeah. So generally I like decentralized solutions because they can be much more creative. They can fit themselves to the situation. For nuclear weapons, it's very hard to do a nice decentralized solution to them because they are by the nature a centralized threat. Maybe you can try to decentralize on resilience in society. That's what I'm doing with Allfed. We're trying to figure out ways of producing food even in this kind of big disasters, and then make sure that these blueprints are widely disseminated to every cabinet office around the world and hopefully one day in every library. But for biotechnology, instead you want disease surveillance. You want to have systems that notice that here is a new weird virus we haven't seen before. Let's quickly sequence it and see if it looks dangerous. We want people to be able to brew up antibodies and vaccines really, really fast. We want to have some kind of agile system that notices that, okay, there is trouble ahead here. We can do something about it. But there might be that, yeah, you want to check when people are synthesizing DNA. Maybe it's a good thing that people are using mail-order DNA synthesis rather than brewing it up in their own lab, because then it goes through this big system where you can actually scan the sequence and look for if it looks problematic. But again, detecting what's actually a threat or not is complicated because biology is complicated and by its nature insecure. A lot of technology can be constructed from the start to be secure. Usually we don't do it because we want to sell it quickly and we might be sloppy in the engineering. But biology started out by evolution. It's kind of insecure mutations of other organisms. Indeed, exchanging DNA, that's a really good survival trait across the biosphere, which means that a lot of these systems are not terribly secure and they change all the time.
Nuclear is the key to our energy needs to a large extent, a very beneficial thing. And of course, advanced bioengineering is the key for us to live long as human beings, which is also a very good thing. And yet we talk about them as what might actually destroy us.
But I think that is true. Most technologies that are powerful can be used for powerful destruction. And it kind of comes naturally. So then you want to figure out a way of shaping it. Fire might be a good example. After all, for a very long time, fires was the main cause of the destruction of cities. Eventually, we figure out fire-safe building materials, but we also figure out fire brigades and fire insurance and created a system that these days fire is a relatively minor problem. It might still be a local problem when you have an accident during Christmas dinner with candles, but that is fortunately usually a very survivable thing. And it might very well be that an advanced civilization, you have a really powerful biotechnology, so when the kids decide to play a prank and design some organism for the garden, there are natural systems that make sure that that organism doesn't get out of hand and doesn't cause too much trouble and also have maybe a good and decent life, etc. But that's going to take a lot of time to develop and probably a lot of trial and error and probably a few tragic discoveries that, oh no, we can't do it like this.
Anders, can I ask you about this big-scale prepper program you're talking about? How do you grow food without sunlight?
Yeah, so it's an interesting problem because if you have a situation where you have a big nuclear exchange, so the sky is darkened by soot in the stratosphere for about 10 years, so temperatures go down and you don't get that much sunlight. There might also be a lot of nitrous oxide destroying the ozone layer, so you also have problems for plants. One thing we have been looking at is, of course, the existing biomass. You have a lot of trees standing around, and cellulose is carbohydrate. It's just that we can't digest that. You can break it down using the enzyme cellulase and use that from a bacterial process, but you can also do it the more low-tech way of just turning it into wood chips and feeding that to fungi or insects. And then you can either eat the fungi or insects, or you can use them as feed for animals and other organisms. So livestock are both a bit of a problem for climate right now, but in this scenario you might not want to slaughter all the livestock because we're actually good at turning plant material into something we can digest. But over time you want to build something more effective. So you might want to both build factories that literally take wood and turn it into paper, something like paper pulp that you can then use for the nutrient chain. There is also natural gas digesting bacteria that can turn into protein. There is a Finnish company, Solar Foods, that are working on using solar energy and gases from air to have bacteria, again to kind of bootstrap the protein. Yeah, that is a real commercial product, and that seems to be a way of doing it, except of course that in the case of a nuclear winter you might have too little sunlight. There are also these more low-tech solutions like kelp farming. Now kelp grows really well and we already do it a little bit. The problem is that it's also not very nutrient dense. So you need to concentrate it in some clever way for us to be able to use it. There is also parts of the tropics which would be way colder than they currently are. But if you, for example, make plastic greenhouses by just putting a plastic film, which is also good for preserving water, because in this scenario you get a fairly dry planet. You could actually do quite a lot of agriculture of crops that normally would grow much further north or south, but down in the tropics. One of the deep problems here is that a lot of the technology looks fairly doable. It's not strange things. But the problem is you need to have a lot of people coordinating and cooperating. You need to probably trade that a lot of the northern and southern countries, they need to send the equipment and the engineers over to the tropics to build these systems and get food in return. So you need a lot of coordination and cooperation, which might of course be hard to come by if you have had a big global disaster, and probably people are still rather unhappy about that nuclear war. But this of course also applies for natural disasters like asteroids and supervolcanoes.
When did you start philosophizing about the future of humanity and risks and so on? You mentioned that you, like me, grew up in a time where the nuclear armageddon threat was very live to all of us. How did you get started, and how did you end up in Oxford?
So I usually give my origin story of being a very curious child, wanted to know everything and read everything. And then growing up in Sweden in the 1970s, it was kind of fairly boring in my Stockholm suburb. So I, of course, went to the library and read all the science fiction novels. And that got me thinking about, there could be societies that work very differently from ours. There could be assumptions that we're totally wrong about. So many cool technologies that don't exist. Maybe we could make them real. So then I started reading the science books. And that's where I got started.
What would be would it be Asimov, or like what authors would it be?
Asimov, Jules Verne, Arthur C. Clarke, Sam J. Lundvall had this very nice compendium of collections of short stories, Det hände imorgon, It happened tomorrow, and that were in all the different libraries around Sweden, and I devoured them. So that was kind of choice short stories all over the place, from satirical to dystopian. So I read essentially everything, and I generally regard myself more of a hard science fiction fan than a follower of new wave science fiction, which was of course very big in the 70s, kind of going inwards instead of thinking about psychedelic questions and social questions. I was more in the realm of actually build space habitats and spacecraft and aliens and robots. That was a little bit more my style. But the bigger picture was, of course, the way we're living right now. It's kind of parochial. It could be different. It has been very, very different in the past. So we should definitely expect the future to be different. So then the question is, can we say something about that? And can we have a say in making it different in a good way?
Anders, I have to ask you, because when I talked to you, I did an interview with you a few years back. You told the same story about how you wanted to know everything. But now that you do know everything, what's left?
Well, the problem is knowing everything just means that the frontier of ignorance just gets bigger. The last week I nerded out completely about instanton physics in the quantum field theory. I didn't know anything about it, and I still don't know enough. And I realized, wow, this is really weird, and a lot of important physics is still not known. We're still struggling in cosmology. We have no clue about the Hubble tension. Why do we get different measures for the expansion rate of the universe using different instruments? Maybe that is some boring instrument error, but it might be something more profound. Turns out that is something called the S8 tension too. Actually, there are other aspects of cosmology that are plain not working as they should. It's not bad. The Big Bang is not in question, but it's still kind of, this is probably a sign that there's something important going on. So you start noticing these weird little discrepancies or problems, and what? Nobody has researched that before. Can't we figure it out? So generally knowing everything is, it's always like running towards the horizon, but the horizon keeps on receding and you get a bigger and bigger world. So what got me really going back then in the 70s and 80s was that, oh, wow, there is so much I can read and discover. And I just kept on doing that. Gradually, I realized that it was not just entertainment. You could actually do something useful with it. But that took a long while. After all, you need to first learn a lot of stuff and then find people who are actually getting out of just learning and into doing. And then trying to figure out what can I do that is actually useful. And I'm still very much a symbol manipulator, moving ideas and pieces of software around rather than actually brewing up anything in the lab. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a scientist, and I imagine that involves white lab coats, lasers and dinosaurs and making inventions. And actually, most scientists don't even wear white lab coats.
Did you have an interest in utopian thinking of various forms?
A little bit, not that much. Partially, of course, because most utopias don't feel particularly interesting and attractive. But it might be that the move towards utopia is really important. One of the great speeches in science fiction is near the end of what is it? Things to Come, based on H.G. Wells' novel, where this is a grand speech about are we going to get the universe or oblivion? It's this kind of very forceful take on that. Yeah, we must search, we must develop, we must explore, and I'm very much on that exploration side rather than the artists, Luddites in that movie that think, no, it's enough. We got enough weird science here. We don't want to know about the universe either. But one of the interesting things, of course, growing up is also realizing, oh, I need to do this together with other people. It's not just about what I do in my armchair or in front of my computer. I might need to get a lot of people invested in the idea. I need to convince them that this is a great idea. Let's pool our resources and do it. Or at least let's not stop Anders from his stupid stuff.
Excuse me. When you say idea, is a particular course you're talking about here, or?
Well, whatever the idea is this week. So generally, I've been involved in the transhumanist movement for a long time. So I think that we should totally upgrade our bodies and minds. I think we should remove involuntary aging. We need to be able to think thoughts that are physically not possible for the current brain. We should be able to link up to computers and get all the senses we can imagine, and trying to figure out what exists in the post-human realm that is of high value that we cannot even conceive of as humans, and then pursue it. But many people say, wait a minute, that's stupid. You're a human, Anders, and humans should aim for human goals. You might want to be an excellent human, but it's not a sensible human goal to be an excellent post-human. I disagree philosophically on that, but there is an interesting debate you can have about it. But even when you get to more practical questions like, well, what about developing brain emulation? Another thing I've been working a fair bit about. Some people say, whoa, that's a really cool idea. And others say, what would we ever use that for? Or that's really a bad and evil thing. The world is worse if that gets developed. And this goes from almost any idea, unless the most bland and boring ideas you have. So the question is, how do you actually get along with people to implement it? What societies allow you to expand and pursue various dreams, and which ones also rightly restrict you from pursuing the stupid and dangerous dreams? Because we should recognize that some of the ideas we have are actually crappy, and we're not always a good judge ourselves for that. Again, that epistemic humility, it's very annoying sometimes having to be humble, but reality has shown again and again that I'm wrong.
So, and you went to university and studied as well, right?
Yeah. So when I came to university, the first thing I did was, of course, get an email account, and finally I got a chance to be on the internet. This was in 1991. Before that, I'd been on various BBS systems using a modem from my computer back home. But now I was on the real internet, and I actually got to meet online people I read about in books and realized they're actually there on the internet. I can send an email to them. I'm on the same mailing list as these guys. That was an astonishing experience. Even more when I started posting and getting involved in conversations and realized that, oh, they're actually turning into actual friends, and I'm actually now part of a global network. So it's kind of funny. Yep, there was also some university education involved. Courses teach me various useful things, but I think the really important part was, of course, just linking up globally and then starting to learn from other people.
Wasn't it the case also, sorry Patrick, wasn't it the case also that the way you got to Oxford was by way of reading something from Nick Boström, and you disagree with him?
Oh yeah, I especially disagreed with his paper on existential risk. So I was really outraged when I read that. He's arguing that there are these big extinction risks or other dystopian risks and that they're really important to stop. And I realized this is a Luddite argument. This is going to be used by all those technophobes that say that the lovely technologies that I think would be great for humanity are too dangerous. So I remember really disagreeing with that. And then gradually I realized actually he's right, but it took a bunch of years. But Nick and me, we have always been bickering in a rather constructive manner. We have very different personalities. I'm way more extrovert. Nick is a bit more introvert. I'm trying out 1,000 ideas. Nick is going for one idea that looks promising and really polishing it until it's a diamond, and so on. So when we're working together on a paper, usually it gets rather loud.
But did you know each other in Sweden? Or?
No, we managed to miss each other by 1 year at one particular course at Stockholm University, but we only met actually at various transhumanist conferences in America. So it's kind of a funny situation. There is a small set of thinkers that tend to run into each other. But this goes at any point in time, because people tend to cluster together with people they like or do similar things. So you get this weird little cluster, whether that is a French salon of Extropians mailing list. And then, of course, years afterwards, we're all reminiscing about the golden age. We're all having these great discussions. But in practice, we're having flame wars about American gun rights. But we remember those few posts that were really, really good. And by now, of course, people have become professors and CEOs and so on. And again, a lot of them didn't do that. But you get the selection effects of memory. But I think the 90s was important.
Just for listeners who may not be familiar with Nick Boström in Swedish.
And a transhumanist philosopher. He's written some very nice pieces about why do we want to enhance ourselves? Why should we actually want to become post-human when we grow up? And defenses of post-human dignity. But also thinking about why is the end of the world so dreadful? Kind of what moral value is there? And also he started, of course, on the issues of artificial intelligence risk, something we were debating on this mailing list in the 90s. Then it looked like it was very far away. We had some people wanting to have a technological singularity as soon as possible because that would solve all our problems. And then gradually some of us started to realize that actually, if we get that powerful AI, maybe it's slightly dangerous. Maybe we need to program it to be nice. How do you program something to be nice? And that turned out to be a surprisingly, shockingly deep problem, both a philosophical problem, but also a technical problem. So a surprising amount of stuff came out of that mailing list. But the Future Humanity Institute, which was founded in 2006, when they were recruiting people, they needed people who both knew a bit about the philosophy of human enhancement technology, but also could explain science to philosophers. And fortunately, I fit the bill because I had done a PhD in computational neuroscience. I've been debating a bit about human enhancement in Sweden and outside, and I could do web design, which was this unheard of super skill back in 2006 at the philosophy department.
Computational neuroscience or web design? We go for the web design.
Yeah, that's probably the most useful.
Computational neuroscience. It's combining savvy of programming with knowledge about the neurological nature of brain.
I took a course about neural networks at KTH led by Professor Anders Sandberg, and that was one of those mind-blowing moments when I realized that, yeah, of course you can simulate how nerve cells interact and simulate larger networks, and we don't have a computer that can do it, but we could perhaps simulate an entire brain. And these interactions are fairly simple. There's still a fair bit of messiness in the science, but in principle you could build things out of that. And you could both make artificial neural networks that solve problems, really cool. Although at this particular point in time in the 90s, neural networks were kind of on the back burner. They had a heyday in the 80s where Hopfield and Hinton and others had demonstrated a lot of cool stuff, but then it didn't pan out very much. So people had started forgetting about them. But you can also imagine simulating real biology or linking biology to computers. That was, of course, catnip for me. So I decided to do a PhD about that, which came in rather handy later on when neural networks became a rather hot topic inside artificial intelligence. But I also got very interested in the possibility of actually scanning entire brains and replicating them in computers, what I call whole brain emulation.
So whole brain emulation... Anders, will it still be me?
That's a good question. It depends on who you define yourself to be.
The only thing that makes me interested in it, if my personality, my memories, the sense of being Peter is kept intact. If it's just a copy of me...
And I think you're getting at something interesting here, because some parts there, well, if the brain emulation is any good, it better have the same memories and behave in the same way. So it should retain the personality and the memories. I think we can agree on that. If you also lose your memories in the process, I think it's a crap form of brain emulation. Might be interesting from a scientific standpoint, but it's not a good way of continuing your life. But then you get to that tricky thing, the sense of being me. So there is, of course, the knowledge. I have this narrative. I've been telling you the story about how I grew up, and I have memories of that, and I might even have these conceited ideas about who I am and so on. And presumably that could also be copied over. But there is also perhaps this feeling. There are the deeper feelings and consciousness. Many people say that software can't be conscious. It's just numbers being moved around in a computer. That can't possibly be a source of consciousness, which is slightly weird because we're soups of water and complicated proteins that are sloshing around, and somehow that generates consciousness. If we believe that can be conscious, why can't numbers be conscious? It's equally weird. So there is a deep question there about the consciousness, but there is also this problem of even defining oneself. Philosophers have been trying all sorts of approaches, but I'm rather fond of my former landlord Derek Parfit's take on that. Actually, personal identity don't really exist. It's a psychological state. So if your copy says it's you, the copy is going to in some sense be correct in its feeling about who it is. It's just that we might say that maybe it's actually a copy, but it's going to feel like it's you.
But let's say the original Peter goes on living, and there's also a new Peter that's only digital, and so their futures diverge, and that's what I'm not interested in. I'm interested in, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I think personal identity, it doesn't exist, or rather, people have different views on personal identity, and they're all kind of right about them being their view. So they can disagree about whether that the uploading or not did replace them or something. But at the same time, that gradual replacement tells us something other. That is, we're kind of fine with slow changes on who we are. I'm actually enjoying being middle-aged. I find it actually quite fun. I want to make sure that my body doesn't deteriorate me more, but generally I'm kind of fine with that. And I think my childhood self would say, Anders, that's just crazy talk. That's just insane. And by the way, what you got political views? That's crazy. And we would probably soon realize that we actually disagreed about a lot of stuff. And I might condescend and pat the little Anders on the head and say, when you grow up, you're going to understand that kissing is actually quite quite nice. And little Anders could go, yuck, that's horrible. Now, that change is kind of a proper change, because I grow up, I change gradually. Each of these steps I can kind of endorse. It's the result of my experience of what I do. Sometimes I might have some little accident. Sometimes I might have that moment of awakening when I realize something important. Now, if there is a sudden transition, if I go into a scanner and the outcome's a digital thing, there is a discontinuity. And many of us, I think, have this intuition that kind of discontinuity doesn't preserve personal identity. I think this is just because we're not used to personal identity behaving like this, because so far it has not happened. The closest we get is maybe somebody who has a stroke or a sudden religious awakening and become a different person in some sense. But even then we see that there is a fair bit of continuity. The body is the same and the name is the same. Here you might actually have a problem, but okay, we got Anders 1 and Anders 2 and leaving the building. Okay, we have a branching. That has never happened before. I'm kind of fine with that, because I got a crazy idea of personal identity. I regard myself as the equivalence class of all sufficiently Anders-like processes.
Yes, that's right. You've said that.
Yeah, I did, or at least an earlier version of me has said it, or maybe a different version. Who knows?
But I mean, you said that you discovered or you got logged on to the internet in '91. I mean, who was that?
I have a memory of doing it.
Has a continuity.
Yeah, the current Anders has a memory of doing that. And the Anders sitting there in the hot computer room up under the eaves of KTH in Stockholm in that September, there is not that much continuity. There is probably a bunch of nerve cells that are in common and some atoms and molecules, but most of the body, of course, have been replaced. And a lot of the views have changed. I would, of course, say they're matured, and maybe my younger self would be saying, no, Anders, you just become more cynical, and you're accepting being middle-aged way too much. Can't you see how bad it is for you? But this is a one-directional thing that I kind of endorse, that that Anders was me. And that early Anders, after a bit of debating, I think would agree that, yeah, I can develop into this future Anders. And we can together then start thinking about further future Anderses and which of these ones would we want to endorse. If there is a far future Anders that become kind of an evangelical Christian, would we say, okay, he's not part of a gang, he's just too weird and different? What about that uploaded Anders? And we have a fairly expansive view, I think, young Anders and me, so we would agree that, yeah, he's part of a gang. But this is a subjective thing. I think a more problematic issue is, of course, can you even do brain emulation? There are many people who say, no, computers can't do the fine things the human mind is doing. And this is, of course, also closely related to the debate about artificial intelligence, which is perhaps not so much about consciousness, although people always confuse themselves by bringing in the computer consciousness in the picture, but more like, are there things that we can think that are very hard or impossible for machines to think?
But, and Anders, like, on your view here that there's no real self-continuity like that, like, why do you also think it's in your interest to survive till tomorrow?
One can take a kind of time-neutral point of view. It's kind of good to be me. I enjoy life. So if tomorrow morning a person wakes up and says, it's good to be me, I should be very happy about that person. Now, it also happens to be a person that shares a lot of my political views. He shares a lot of my research interest. He might continue my projects. It seems like I have a very good reason to care for making sure that tomorrow morning that person has a good morning, rather than drinking a lot of alcohol tonight and giving him a hangover.
So you don't think you have a particular interest for you to wake up tomorrow? You just want someone to wake up tomorrow and be happy and have, roughly your ideas.
At least now when
life.
I'm kind of in my philosophical armchair, that makes sense. In practice, of course...
That's not good enough for me. I can tell you that.
And I think this is an important issue, because we do have our normal sense of self-preservation. I do look twice when crossing the street, and yeah, in some sense, you could argue that, oh yes, I'm looking out for future Anders and making sure that future Anders isn't somebody who's just been run over by a truck. But in some sense, no, the way you function in everyday life, you're not going to go on these philosophical tangents that much. Most of the time, we think of ourselves as unitary beings enclosed by a skin, having a particular lifeline, etc. But it makes local sense a lot. And it's built in very much in our psychology and even in our animal nature. But then again, I think we can go beyond that. And as technology gets more advanced, we might get much weirder sense of self and identity. But meanwhile, we better make sure our bodies hang together.
I think that's going to be very hard to explain to your wife that, I just want some woman who's happy to wake up tomorrow next to me.
Oh yeah, that is actually
who's approximately like you in various ways.
Yeah, my poor husband has been forced to listen to a whole bunch of these philosophical thought experiments, and he's still fine with me. So something seems to be working, but I don't know what it is. Philosophers, of course, joke that never marry a functionalist; they can always be replaced by another functionalist.
Well, so. Of course, right. This is one of these philosophical questions that really divide philosophers in intuition, and it's almost what I really would like to know is why. That is, why are what explains that we have such different intuitions about this? Like you say, scanning, or you're transported, or somehow there's a copy, and it's not good enough for some, and it's good enough for others, and it's continuity for some, it's not continuity for others, etc. And we have, and it's very funny. I laugh at myself. I have quite strong intuitions here that are contrary to yours. I mean, I almost feel like I can prove it. Like you have these, examples where you copied but you survive, and of course then you know that you are not that copy.
Yeah.
So, or you say, well, God could right now make copies of us free, and we're in China somewhere, but of course we know we're sitting here, so those are not us.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how perfect they are, and it doesn't matter how perfect you make. I mean, even ordinary objects. You say there's a statue of Liberty in Las Vegas. It's not a question of it becoming more perfect for it to become the Statue of Liberty that we talk about, or the Eiffel Tower. So like even normal objects.
Yeah. But I think
seem that you can't capture everything by just copying them. There's something in.
But I think it's also
sorry. Yeah.
I think we're also not so much objects as processes. There is a kind of ongoing activity, and that is actually the really essential part of us. It's not enough that you kind of freeze me perfectly. Well, in some sense, the Anders object is still around, but the Anders process, which is what I actually care about, that needs to be ongoing. And that is partially, of course, why the Las Vegas Statue of Liberty, well, it's kind of a copy. It's a process doing something rather different from the Statue of Liberty in New York. Although it's much more object-like. The statues generally don't walk around too much. But getting back to your question, I think it's a really good one. We have sometimes extremely different outlooks on the world, and we miss that. For example, it was only a few decades ago people discovered that about 25% of people are super tasters. They feel extra bitter taste, so a lot of food that tastes really nice to 75% of people actually tastes pretty awful to them. This has always been the case, and it only took until recently when we discovered that this is an actual fact over perception. It took surprisingly long before people recognized that color blindness was actually a thing. And more recently, people have been starting to talk about aphantasia. So there are some people who don't have an inner imagery when they envision something. So if I say a juicy red apple, to most people, they are going to imagine some red apple. They're going to see it in their mind's eye. Maybe in a hazy way, maybe in a stylized way. But there is going to be some kind of visual precept. But I have friends who don't see anything. And it's really odd because they're highly accomplished in doing complex three-dimensional planning and for scientists, science and engineering. And I think the same goes also for philosophy, where various intuitions about how the world works, or what probability is, or what the self is, that might be almost as radically different between some people. We don't notice that in normal conversation because most of the time we don't talk about split personalities and scanning people and replicating them. That's kind of unusual talk, but it brings to the foreground some of these very deeply different intuitions.
I think one of the most salutary developments in philosophy, really the best thing that's happened right in a long time, is exactly that turn of the experimental philosophy and the kind of survey-based philosophy, the kind of new empirical philosophy, where instead of just assuming that, I'm thinking for mankind, let's see what other people think who are also smart and also think about these. And they ask, like, for example, the thing we're discussing here, there are surveys on where the intuitions lie there, and other things, right? That in the past, philosophers kind of always took for granted that they were thinking for all mankind always.
Often that kind of thinking, when you are in that mode, it becomes a particular kind of thinking too. So I do love, especially the more annoying papers showing that philosophers have just as much cognitive biases as everybody else. Despite studying rationality and thinking about that, Eric Schweizgebel has this series of papers where he demonstrates that ethicists seem to have unusually bad morals when it comes to doing as we say and not stealing stuff. Kind of interesting. Ethics as a study doesn't make you a better person. Oh dear.
It's almost that one should have a list of biases to check yourself in the morning, before you start thinking about things and say, and I think in some sense, I think like one of the big biases is the bias to think that biases are about other people.
Have a printout of Wikipedia's list of biases hanging from the bulletin board at the institute. So every time you passed by, the draft of air usually made it flutter a bit as a warning. And it's a very, very long list. The problem is, of course, it's hard to avoid the biases, and some of them are useful. Quite often we use these biases as heuristic shortcuts for actually doing practical things. And if you use them in the right way, they work pretty well. The problem is, of course, recognizing that now I'm misusing this bias and now they're misleading me. There is also the problem that some of these deep intuition differences, like about personal identity, might not even be biases. That might be something different. Might be a bit like color blindness or something very more profound in how we experience stuff.
Or it could be like a Wittgensteinian problem, that it's a malformed question, or there's some assumptions that are.
I think that's true for an awful lot of not just philosophy but our everyday psychology. One of the interesting things I realized when I was doing my PhD, which dealt with learning and memory, was that we have these different memory systems in the brain. And today, of course, you get a nice overview in your cognitive science course. But they were discovered within the last 100 years. So there was a kind of awareness among the ancient Greek that, some people have better memory and some have worse. And there was even a kind of concept of working memory you can kind of trace in some of the Socratic dialogues. But it was really discovered in the late 1800s that, okay, we have short-term memory and long-term memory. And later discovered, oh yes, memory has parts and they function independently of each other. This is something every single human on this planet has had, and it was not part of our knowledge. We hadn't done the experiments to actually make it clear to ourselves that we work like that. And that's probably one of the more obvious aspects of our mind.
It's natural that we have different starting points, but also when we have a philosophical discussion, it's a bit painful because we know that we have to take certain concepts as given, even to have the conversation. Usually we can't question all of the concept all the time, so to speak. So
usually philosophers start out by kind of outlining, here are the assumptions I'm going to use, and typically the others grudgingly say, okay, let's go for this conversation, but we all know what I think about assumption 4, 5 and 6 here, and then you play along that game. This is quite often, of course, why many philosophical conversations totally outrage outsiders when they come into the room and hear somebody say, and that's why we need to torture that person forever. And he doesn't mean that he actually is in favor of torturing people. But given the assumptions in this particular weird thought experiment, that follows logical and that makes some interesting point. That kind of extreme decoupling is very alien from normal thinking. Again, getting into the issue of how to function in real life, you need to be connected to the real world. But you also need to be able to sometimes take a step back, take a deep breath and realize, what are we doing here? What is going on?
I mean, like our ideal is to follow the logic wherever it takes us. And so also from the point of view of outsiders, it can appear a bit rude.
And sometimes that's worth doing, and sometimes you need to be kind of, okay, let's be polite about this, or point out that, okay, now here is an important thing and now we need to get into a tough topic. This is, of course, extra interesting when talking about things like life extension and enhancement, because it does step on a lot of people's philosophical toes. Many people have rather firm intuitions about their view on what a proper life is, what a proper lifespan is. And then these guys come up and say, oh, we might be able to fix that. It causes quite a lot of emotion.
Yeah. So from your perspective then of continuity in self and the lack thereof, and you can't, being a philosopher, you can't be seeing death, your personal death, as very bad for you, right?
No, I'm kind of in line with Epicurus there. Okay, when I'm dead, I'm not worried about stuff, so that's not a problem. I might be more concerned about there are various people who seem to like me, so they might be sad, and that's kind of a bad thing.
But it's not bad for you.
Yeah. I think
It can't really be bad for you.
I don't
right?
really think so.
If you're right.
The problem is, of course, most dying involves actually quite a lot of decline most of the time. And that one is bad for me. I don't want to spend my last 10 years infirm or anything like that. That's now that is a negative that actually affects me. And I might, of course, have preferences about how the world looks beyond my life. I might still say that, yeah, I'm hoping humanity survives and goes to the stars and has a glorious future for as long as there can be a future. I have a preference about that. And if my death makes it less likely for that to happen, if I were conceited enough to think that I'm important in guiding humanity, which is very easy to imagine when you're sitting in the philosophical armchair, then of course I might say, okay, that's very important for me to keep me alive. But in practice, it might just be that it's better for me to avoid that decline and making sure that I have fun. But the death itself is much more problematic than pain and suffering.
Yeah, so dying, the act of dying can be painful, and that's bad, and there can be bad consequences of you dying. But your death as such, that is ceasing to exist, cannot be a worry for you.
Not really. And
like when you were wearing your philosophical hat.
Yeah, exactly. That philosophical hat is, of course, maybe it's made out of tinfoil, but it does protect you a little bit from the kind of a general existential angst. You can very happily say, well, we're living in an Einsteinian universe where time and space are the same. I'm not on the other side of the room, and the fact that I'm not necessarily in the far future, or for that matter, the far past, I shouldn't be too concerned that I'm just an elongated shape in time and space, and that's it.
But if you die tomorrow, you won't be able to see this episode coming out and a lot of other fun things. I mean, you're going to miss out a lot by being dead. I mean, that's really bad for you, right?
Of my preferences I have right now. So if I got a crystal ball and saw that, no, I got run over by a truck tomorrow morning, I would be very unhappy about that. Of course, you could argue that from a utilitarian standpoint, just keep away from the crystal ball and everything is going to be fine. You don't know anything until the truck hits you. But I still think that we have preferences that actually matter about the far future. And they're both personal ones about how well you want your life to go. But even more, the other regarding preferences. We care for other people, and we might care for humanity and the joint project.
Peter?
We're going to talk about AI.
Yep, we can totally do
well,
that.
I mean...
I could say that, Patrick has...
Yeah.
I thought you were laying a trap, Patrick. Because it doesn't seem to me that you're satisfied with that answer that you got from Anders now. And I should say that everyone listening to this should view our very first episode where I interviewed Patrick about these things. But so I thought you were going to continue down this path, and then we could go on for maybe another 30 minutes talking about...
Yeah, I mean, it's true.
I'm all in favor for going to AI now, but you keep going.
Well, I mean, it's because I do see that from Anders' point of view of what he regards himself to be. It does seem to follow that he could be rather easygoing about his own death as such. So I acknowledge that. I mean, that's not my own perspective. I think death is a very bad thing for me. I mean, besides the pain of dying and the consequences, I think it's bad for me not to exist anymore because of all the good things that I can't enjoy anymore, primarily. And also all the extrinsic things, that the good that I create around for people around me and so on. And plus that I don't want to die. I want to be alive. I mean, it frustrates some of my desires.
I think you're much more closer to the normal perspective. But I still think there is something interesting about, are we running away from something or running towards something? I like life. I love being alive, enjoying things, and I want kind of more of that. But there is also many people I know that are trying to not die. And many of them are then sacrificing quite a lot in order to not die. And of course, to some extent, we all do that by kind of avoiding very tasty but really unhealthy food and drugs, for example. But at the same time, a lot of avoiding dying might also mean that, yeah, you have to do a lot of exercise. Or if Sinclair is right, maybe a bit less exercise, but at least some. And exercise is still cumbersome, and you get sweaty, and it takes time that you could have used for something else. So there is that thing about, are we running away from something bad or running towards something good?
I mean, my intuition is that it was like supremely in the interest of 12-year-old Patrick to grow up to be me now and continue to exist. And regardless of what theory I have, and which is very difficult to have a theory of the self and identity, of course.
There is something about the internal contract we have with ourselves, the kind of deal that I'm going to behave myself, so tomorrow Anders is going to wake up happy, and I'm kind of more or less happy with past Anders in his ability to go to bed at a reasonable hour, so I wake up rested. How do we actually negotiate with ourselves across our lifespan? And I think that's important, because quite often we build these narratives about our past and who we are. But I think far too few people also think about their future selves and actually want to develop that, because we might want to go in the direction of our ideal self and figure out where are the good futures I might want to be a part of.
Do you think that it's morally ideal not to prefer your own good to anyone else's in particular? Or
if everybody were kind of equal, doing it equally, I don't think it mattered very much. I think right now it's like that old joke, everybody thinks about themselves, not about me. If everybody were the kind of thinking about everybody but themselves, it wouldn't be a problem. In practice, we're pro-social. We care about others, but we care about ourselves. And you probably need to maintain a balance there. One of my more funny papers was I did an artificial life simulation of agents that could update the morals. They could kind of weigh others more or less highly and themselves more or less highly. And we could demonstrate that you actually got a convergence to being pro-social, with some agents being a bit altruistic and some being a bit more selfish. But the distribution actually looked quite a bit like the actual distribution get among people. And part of that is, of course, we have only survived that because we care about others, others care about us, we form groups that work well together. And that's kind of part of our literal DNA. And it also feels rather good being part of that, but it also can cause some of the worst anguish ever when you don't feel like you're loved, that you don't feel like you're part of the group, or you get anxious about getting expelled from the group. So that is kind of part of being human. Now, we could imagine doing genetic upgrades so we don't care about other people, but it's a question whether that would actually be much of an upgrade, because you might be able to function somewhat in society, but actually you're probably more effective in society if you're surrounded by people who you like and they like you back.
Psychopathy becomes the new normal.
Yeah, that was actually the reason we did this paper, because my co-author, a philosophy student, he believed that if we could just go to the drugstore and change our outlook, everybody will eventually become sociopaths because we're just so successful. And I felt like, oh, that sounds creepy. I wonder if that's actually true. And to our surprise, we got this very solid result. And actually, the pro-social people win out. It has to do with symmetry. If you and me are playing some kind of game and I care about your winning and because I'm an altruist and I don't care about myself, and you're also an altruist, we're at cross purposes because we're both trying to give each other a high score and kind of sabotaging each other's effort. Similarly, if we're both very selfish, we also have the same problem. If we both kind of want the sum total to be good, then actually we're symmetric and it actually works surprisingly well.
But do you think it's ideal to care more about your own happiness, apart from it being instrumentally useful in a social context? That is, do you think we have let's say, a kind of right to prefer our own well-being over a random person's, or are you more inclined to be more 100% altruistic as an ideal theory?
I think I'm not completely 100% altruistic. I'm surrounded by a lot of effective altruists and the hard-nosed consequentialists who might be willing to bite that philosophical bullet. But then again, I grew up being a fairly libertarian, so I'm somewhere in between these positions. I think I have a privileged position about what makes my life go well. I know a lot more about me than most people know, which means that I can do things that make this particular instance of a human actually have a life that functions rather well. That is a good reason to use that knowledge to make sure that the Anderses are happy. It's still not a strong enough reason to say, and that's why I need to totally focus on making myself very happy at the expense of everybody else. And indeed, because we're social, we're also getting this feedback loop that actually I have a lot of people, I care about them being happy, because if they're unhappy, I get unhappy. If they're happy, I get happy because they're happy, etc. So I think I end up somewhere in between.
So, I mean, as a libertarian, you do think that you have a right to say, okay, I know you would all be happier if I came to the party, but I'm not. I don't feel like it. And there's nothing morally wrong with me not wanting to contribute to your happiness this evening. Oh, and you know, and regardless if at the end of the world it really did minimize your happiness, so to speak. So you can't fix it by any long-term looking at it. I mean, if you're a libertarian, you say you have right to make certain choices, even if they don't benefit other people.
And I think that is true. Rights are very useful as a kind of backstop. You want to have rights to say, well, we can negotiate about some things, but this one I actually get to decide over. Because if you don't have those backstops, then you can be totally run over. One of the problems with the typical utilitarian thought experiment, you go to a hospital with a broken leg, but so many people can be saved by your organs. So actually the doctors ought to transplant all those organs to other people, even though it means killing you. That doesn't happen if you have rights. You can make a utilitarian argument that actually in many cases making these decisions is really hard, so we need to set up rules that make the cognitive load easier, and before you know it, the rule utilitarian starts talking about stuff that sounds very much like rights. They're fundamentally different, an ethicist would say, because we're actually not fundamental in the same way as most of the deontologists and others who really, really love rights would say rights are. But they still have the same function, and I think there is a deep truth that we want to have these crystallized rules that simplify thinking and acting in society. Because again, we got limited brains. We can't always solve the kind of total utility maximizing happiness calculus for the world. So we simplify it into simpler parts. And that means rights and rules.
This is often relevant when we talk about life extension, when people make social consequences argument against it, and they say, well, you're selfish if you want to live. So, for example, Musk, for example, thinks that we need to have a certain brevity of life in order not to stop progress. That is, people need to die, get out of the way for science and new ideas. And I would say that even if somebody could prove that me dying now would help philosophy develop, because I'm sitting here promulgating some old idea, I would say, okay, fine, but I'm not going to die. And it's my prerogative. I'm not prepared to die for progress that way. And which would be a kind of rights-based, not libertarian necessarily, but a liberal argument.
And you could even argue that collective of humanity or science, what kind of moral patient is that? So we might really care about if I need to give up my life to save some other moral patient. But there is something that can be said that maybe humanity as a whole is not really a moral patient. I'm not entirely certain I would agree with that claim, but you could say progress. Okay, is progress a moral patient? No, it's instrumentally good that things are getting better, especially for future generations. That's great for them. But it's not like progress itself. We need to sacrifice things for that. It used to be that scientists did a lot of more self-experimentation. And in the Victorian era, it was even seen as you need to kind of sacrifice yourself to science. It was seen as a very noble thing to do. But when you think about it, wait a minute, sacrifice yourself to science. This sounds like some really weird pagan ritual or something. It makes for very good pulp science fiction, but it doesn't make much moral sense, actually. Yeah, instrumental, it might be useful to risk your life in order to save others, or maybe there are some experiments that were worth doing, and the only person who has enough informed consent to do this dangerous experiment might be me because I know what I'm doing. But that sacrificing yourself for some abstraction is generally not a good thing. And I think we rightly gave up on that, although we unfortunately also stopped doing enough self-experimentation.
It strikes me, though, that your view of yourself would lead to a kind of very altruistic outlook. Like if really you could, by donating all of your vital organs to 5 people like Anders, like why would you resist? Why wouldn't that be ideal choice for you?
Again, from the philosopher's armchair, I don't see a particular reason against it. Of course, I'm going to scream and fight against it as an actual person because I know my emotions, etc. But I think there is something about if you have enough similar in a person. So it wouldn't surprise me that if we achieve brain emulations and they work really well, of course I'm going to make copies of myself because there's too much to do, there are too many places to be. And then there is that question about, am I willing to sacrifice this particular instance for the other Anderses? And intellectually, I think I'm totally fine with that. I think I would be more fine with it knowing that, okay, I got backup copies and they're stashed away on the moon in a lot of different locations. So this is only a temporary setback, but this particular one is going to be blown up or whatever. But then again, getting over the emotional reactions is going to most likely be a rather tough thing. I kind of know that philosophical ideas rarely guide actual behavior when you're actually sitting there and sweating in the cockpit or whatever it is.
But the moral ideal would be for you to sacrifice yourself.
I'm very much on the consequentialist side of things. So that also makes me a somewhat unusual libertarian.
Yeah. So, Peter, wow, we've been down a hole here of so AI, right?
Yeah, let's talk about AI.
Yeah.
Where should we start? I mean, the thing is that one question that's kind of hovering above all of this discussion, or at least when we talked in the beginning about nuclear warfare and biological weapons and so on, is that it seems like the timelines for capabilities of artificial intelligence are shrinking really, really fast now, to the point where, to me at least, it would feel daunting to say anything about the future right now. Because there could be quite a lot of changes happening in just a few years. I mean, you hear increasingly bullish talk from OpenAI developers and others. They're talking openly now about superintelligence, which they didn't do like 2 years ago. Then it was way outside the Overton window. So how do you feel about all of this happening right now?
It's a kind of odd feeling that the stuff we were talking about on the Extropians mailing list in the 90s, writing emails and just sitting there in text and discussing what about technological singularity, is kind of getting very mainstream, and not just mainstream, it's serious business. We're literally having governments getting into geopolitical struggles about exporting AI relevant chips, etc. And it's kind of an odd feeling because back in the 90s we could look back on the history of AI and notice that it's been moving forward. We're technological optimists on this list, and we think it's going to go much further. But we also recognize that there have been long AI winters and people have been over-promising, and then some good results and promising results, and then nothing happened with the fourth generation AI in the 80s, etc. So we had this intellectual idea that, of course, things might speed up and might even speed up at a surprising pace because people are bad at paying attention to exponentials, but surely it's not going to be that fast. So when Ray Kurzweil started popularizing many of these ideas in the age of spiritual machines and the singularity is near, many of us were still kind of smugly saying, yeah, he's predicting 2045, yeah, right. But some of us were saying 2030, and some people like Elias Yudkowsky had stormed in on the list and said, look, we're going to make it happen earlier. That is the way of doing it. So we were kind of thinking about it intellectually. And even as some academic who've been working with neural network, there was this shock that happened around 2012 when ImageNet started working well. Well, AlexNet was the neural network that suddenly did really good on recognizing objects. We have been trying for years doing that, and it turns out that if you have more data and more compute, you get radically better results. Nobody understands why this is true to this day. This is kind of one of the embarrassments of the field, but we're riding a wave we don't know where it came from. And we know to some extent on how to make it more powerful, add more compute, tweak the algorithms in the right way. But why they work so well, that is hard to tell. And people still took a long while to recognize that this was going somewhere. There is still to this day, of course, many people say, no, this is all hype, just like last time. There is nothing here to see. But then again, today I asked a language model to go through my notes from my brainstorm, and it made some really interesting new comments about the research I'm doing. This is not something it found on the internet. It's actually, I think we can surely say it's a thought there about something that it haven't learned. It is something that it deduced. That is something. And again, artificial general intelligence that can be applied across many domains, was again something most people in the field were not wanting to talk about until a few years ago. So now we're getting to this point where people are really putting in a lot of effort, putting in a lot of money. And this is somewhat scary because things can, of course, go haywire on a more grand scale. Right now, AI is still relatively safe. Yes, the language models have talked to people, and people have actually literally committed suicide because of getting depressed when getting into a doom spiral and talking with this model. Yeah, we are getting deep fakes that are really, really compelling, and you can scale up systems for political manipulation, not to mention drone warfare, etc. Already these things are going to make the future way more exciting than we might actually like. But it looks like we're also getting a feedback loop in programming. So most programmers I know of these days, they're making use of AI support. We're complaining a lot about its inadequacies. It's not always as good as it ought to be. But it looks like it's getting better at a pretty steady pace. And the AI companies are, of course, very interested in feeding that back into their own work. Now, a lot of the work in AI is not so much programming a lot of code. It's coming up with more clever ways of applying that code. And that's still tricky, but we can be pretty sure they're doing that. So it looks like we're actually aiming at getting that feedback loop going. And this is fascinating, exhilarating, and rather scary because it's very clear that many of the people involved don't take safety that seriously. There is also a surprising number of people who do take safety seriously, but now we have enormous profits and stock options, and that might motivate people to behave in particular ways too. So this is, the next few years are going to be pretty wild.
Yeah, I know that Nick Bostrom in his, he wrote about a kind of future after all of this. In Deep Utopia that came out like 1 year ago or something like that. He also had a phrase. I don't know if he referenced that, uses that phrase in the book, but he talks about it in an interview that I saw. He talks about, look, if we can imagine something to be possible, if we only had the resources and the time to make it real, it's probably going to happen at some point. But now with AI, we could probably shrink even that development quite a lot. And so he talked about this. He used this phrase, a telescoping of the future. So how do you think about that? Do you agree on that we could have this telescoping of the future and that we could see pretty big advancements in science, in manufacturing, in energy, in all of these areas, every area, essentially?
Yeah, I think that is a possible prospect. I think the most modest version of it is there are many domains where AI is going to lead to this telescope. So we get great advancements fairly simply. We can just let the AI run through a lot of mathematics and prove things or figure out some physics. And then we might turn out to the other domains like gardening, where it's hard to telescope the future of gardening. But you could of course say that, yeah, you're going to use this also to figure out how to telescope the future in other domains. And it might mean that a lot of things that we right now regard as very far in the future are much closer than expected. Indeed, I spent a few days on Twitter being in a sprawling big debate about whether we should expect it to be possible to build a Dyson sphere around the sun before 2040. And a Dyson sphere collects all the sunlight, and the guy mentioning it was kind of dismissing this and saying, look, this shows that these guys are just crazy. This can't be real. And I, of course, immediately nerded out on the technical details about what would actually put the timescales on. How quickly could you encase the sun in solar collectors? What would need to be true? And I don't think the sun is going to be enclosed in solar collectors by 2040. I'm fairly confident that it's not going to be. But I don't think I can say that, okay, I'm 100% confident about it or even 99% confident. It's just that I think it's going to take longer because of a bunch of practical, somewhat boring reasons. That telescoping is kind of an interesting issue because normally we tend to say, yeah, a lot of stuff is safely beyond my era. Of course, if you like life extension, you can't do that because you might actually say, yeah, yep, it might be 1,000 years off, but I'm actually going to be around for that. This is one reason why I think life extension is one of the greenest things you can do, because you start caring about the environment way more when you realize that you have to live in the environment of the future.
We have, most people would think, a kind of moral responsibility not to pollute the world for future generations and preserve it and avert a catastrophe. Do we also have a moral obligation to develop technology as much as we can for future generations?
Technologies. I'm very fond of what I call differential technology development. You want to change the order when some technologies arrive. So you want certain technologies that make the future safer to arrive much earlier. It would have been a great thing if we had figured out how to go to space and settle other planets before we discovered nuclear weapons. Because that way, even if there was nuclear war locally, it might not wipe out humanity. Similarly, if we had invented vaccinations and managed to control many of the big viral diseases before going on transoceanic voyages, we might not have killed off a lot of people on other continents. It would have been a very good thing to have those technology earlier. Now, we sadly didn't in our timeline, but you could imagine other timelines where that happened. And we might want to think about future technologies. Can we get some of the safety making technologies early? So when it comes to AI, for example, you want to have systems that align AI with human interest and make it safe so you can be around it. You want that before you get to the really, really powerful AI. Similarly, we might envision ways of doing global disease surveillance to really quickly catch an outbreak of something novel before everybody has a biolab and can brew up whatever bacterium they want in the comfort of their own kitchen. So I think,
go on, Anders.
And I think there are other technologies that we just want as much as possible, like automating medicine so the doctors and nurses are not the bottleneck for giving people good health. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there is a question what the doctors and nurses will do, and they might complain perhaps about competition from the robots, but it's a good thing for people. And similarly, we might say there are certain technologies we really don't want until much later, hopefully perhaps never. A way of causing false vacuum decay to wipe out the universe. Let's hope we never invent that technology. Let's hope we don't invent a too easy method of making black holes, at least until we have moved away from living on a single planet.
Yeah, so you mentioned the gardening, that AI might have a difficult time doing gardening. I was thinking, there's so much stuff happening around the development of humanoid robots right now, and it seems like you could use reinforcement learning quite well there as well, and train in simulation and so on. You don't have to have all of these physical, real experiences anymore, at least. So it might be that we actually have embodied AI as well quite soon. I know that people are talking about Moravec's law and so on, but it seems like we might be on the path to solve these problems as well. I kind of look forward to having my own humanoid, if it's kind.
Yep. We want it to be kind, and probably we need a lot of simulations of social situations for it to train itself to learn how to be a kind entity. And that's, of course, the tricky part. Simulating a robot that can play with hard objects like toys is fairly easy, because that kind of physics simulator is not too impossible to write. Indeed, you get it with most gaming engines. Doing soft body simulations like plant, that's tricky also, because now you want to have a simulator of how a plant responds to pruning. But it's totally doable. It's just that right now, as far as I know, very few people are working on the problem. But with good AI, we might be able to have an AI help us solve that problem. So we might use AI that is good at programming and making simulators, for making simulators first of a garden, so we get the gardening bots, and then of social interactions, so we get the kind bots. The interesting part is, of course, that intelligence is in some sense a universal solvent. It's supposed to be a generally applicable way of solving problems. Many people reject that and say, wait a minute, isn't there different kinds of intelligence? But I think that is partially because it's effective to specialize. Some people specialize their intelligence on math or words or images or kinesthetic stuff. Deep down, there is this underlying ability to solve problems over general environments. But even that one can, of course, have very different styles and also different failure modes. Current AI sometimes shows these embarrassing holes in its knowledge and common sense, even though we thought we had solved it. So there is another issue about making it robust and resilient. The gardening bot we need to make sure that it's not going haywire when it encounters the wrong kind of rose bush. But again, we might say, oh, we're totally going to try to make AI to act as oversight for our AI. So one question is whether this is doable. I'm doing a project right now about, are there limits to scalable oversight, which is kind of a jargon term for this. And there is an interesting theoretical argument we're dealing with that maybe there is. But then we get the next question, how do we do it in our society? And usually we do it by distributing. We have different people, different institutions, reputations, and many other things that help us actually do oversight. It's not just one thing keeping us nice.
Yeah. One thing I've been, two thoughts I've been having lately is that, one, the AI safety thing is, that's not going to work because we don't have enough time to fix it. The capabilities are evolving too fast. And the second thing that I guess people are talking about this feel the AGI or feel the superintelligence. I've been having this feeling more and more lately where I kind of realized that this world is soon, of course I could be wrong, this is speculation, but I at least had the feeling that this world is soon not going to be run by humans anymore. We're going to live in it, but some entity is going to make the decisions.
Yeah, to some extent that's already true. They're called corporations, institutions and states. We have made this kind of artificial intelligence made out of a lot of humans and pieces of paper and rules and a common understanding of what it's supposed to be. And unfortunately, these are pretty powerful and dangerous entities. Many of them are literal killers, and we want to figure out ways of forcing them to be nicer, which is unfortunately a really, really hard problem. So we're already kind of in that situation. You can say, of course, yeah, but the state is still made out of a lot of people. So there is a lot of understanding of a human perspective in what a state does. I think if you're having a somewhat cynical view of what states do, you would say, yeah, and it's not using that very much. States actually are pretty inhumane for the most part. But by adding AI to the world, we might get things that are definitely different from humans, that might both be big actors, but it might also be part of our institutions. I think we're already seeing more and more cyborg institutions where AI is playing a more and more important role in mediating signals, interpreting them. If I'm supposed to write a dreary report about my research, I might very well try to use ChatGPT to write it up based on my notes. And then I send it to some beleaguered bureaucrat at the funding agency, and he's of course using ChatGPT to summarize what does Anders actually say with this report. And eventually we just get cut out of the loop, and the ChatGPT talks to ChatGPT, and that's going to fix the decision. The problem is, of course, safety is not optional, and to some extent many organizations discovered to their horror that if you just install AI, it's sometimes doing things badly, and that costs you money or a reputation. So I think we are going to see attempts of using this in the right way. I'm hoping we can get a bit forethought about this, and that people are being proactive about building systems that are actually somewhat reliable. But yeah, my cynical side and my futurist side said, no, people are just going to try a lot of these things, and some big disasters are going to force everybody to realize, okay, I don't want to be those guys on the front page of a newspaper. We need to shape up our system, at least before the government shows up and says that it's a law saying that this system needs to behave like this.
Yeah, but I mean, Eliezer Yudkowsky, he was right all along with the idea that even if we have the OpenAI's closed models, some will come along and create the open source version of that 6 months later. And that's just what's happening. We had DeepSeek now coming out just today, I think, or the other day. We're recording this in January. That seems to be as good as the first reasoning model from OpenAI.
Yeah.
So it seems like, yeah, I'm not confident that we're going to be extinct soon, but I'm also not confident that AI safety is going to help us there. I mean, I think it's more if we get lucky.
Yep. I'm rather optimistic that I think many of the safety aspects actually are solvable, and perhaps more easily solvable than, for example, Eliezer thinks. He's very much the doomer's doomer. He thinks we're kind of 99% certain to be doomed if nobody listens to him. And yeah, maybe we're living in that world, but I think we're living in a softer world. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a real mess. For example, I don't think the likely disaster scenario is so much that a server somewhere decides, I think therefore I am, and then goes off and takes over a world and covers it all in solar panels and data centers. I think a more likely thing is we're getting pretty aligned AI, and you can't live without it. Indeed, you really want to have your little legal expert system in your phone to fend off all the lawsuits from bad guys you pass in the street. And we get gradually embedded in a world of really useful AI that is solving a lot of problems. And then gradually we start noticing that the world is starting to turn very strange. And when we check on it, we realize, yeah, it's an emergent phenomenon coming from all these AI systems that individually are pretty well aligned with human flourishing. It's just that the collective effect is going off the rails in some complicated way we can't understand and we can't individually do anything about. So we're just along for the ride, wherever that goes. That, I think, is my more likely disaster scenario. Now that...
Could you exemplify that?
Well, you could imagine that you get more and more companies, they want, of course, to make good decisions. So they get advice AI that gives really good advice on how to maximize your stock market returns. And not taking that advice is generally bad for the stock market returns. So they are going to advise, of course, the executives that don't listen to the advice that they should be sacked or given some other position. And gradually, of course, if it's really good AI, they're going to give very effective advice. For the companies that use it will flourish. The other ones will not flourish. So after a while, you only have companies that are making use of it. Similar things might be happening in government. You need to regulate these fast-moving AI-supported companies. So you need a lot of AI systems to advise the government. Otherwise, it's going to be totally overwhelmed by literally millions of simulated lobbyists and lawyers that are just manipulating them. So they need to fend it off by having their own kind of software. And similarly, we individually are going to have our own agents doing research for us and protecting us from malicious agents and just keeping abreast of what's going on and giving us a little advice to keep our life going really well. So now we have a world where humans are in charge on paper. In practice, what is in charge is this network of systems. In some sense, you have a market of agents, and it's the market that reaches some kind of equilibrium. But it's an equilibrium that might be very dynamic. It might be going places. It's figuring out growth domains, many of which humans have never heard of, and are now getting developed and getting more and more resources. So suddenly we find that the niobium market is becoming very important for some reason that no organic being understands, and maybe it's actually totally pointless. It might be something akin to a stock market bubble. But by now we can't do very much about that. Now niobium it is. Now they get a world that is maximizing for the niobium trade, etc. So we might find ourselves not in charge of a world we're embedded in, which might actually locally be fairly pleasant, but it's kind of going off the rails in weird directions. Now, the tricky part here is we want, as humans, to be in charge. And part of that is probably just this selfish urge that, like any biological organism, allowing others to run our life and dominate us has generally been very bad for the survival and fitness. So we feel really bad when we're not autonomous. So we want to be in charge, or at least believe we're in charge. But I think we also want to have ensure that humanity is embedded in whatever the technosphere becomes, in a way that actually is a good niche for humanity and is not going to kind of end with the AI systems deciding oxygen. Why do we keep that oxygen around? It's just causing so much rust. Let's remove that from the atmosphere. We want to be like the mitochondria in our bodies. Our cells can't survive without mitochondria. And in some sense, the mitochondria are smugly thinking, yeah, we did it really well there back a few billion years ago when we convinced these eukaryotic cells to carry us around and build these elaborate animals and plants and fungi to just keep us well fed. We're just producing a bit of energy for them. And maybe the goal for humanity should be that, yeah, we're giving some goals and pizzazz to the AI civilization, and they can't live without us, but we're a small part of something much bigger.
Peter, we are keeping Anders here over time a bit, I think.
Yeah, but again, this is where life extension comes in handy.
It sure does. I mean, the most horrible thing about life, I think, is that we have to specialize and limit ourselves. I mean, there's so much for us to experience and learn, and so many conversations to have.
One of the problems is, of course, that linear time still forces us to do that. Even if we had infinite time, there are so many more ideas and conversation. So in some sense, we always have to limit ourselves. But there are the annoying limits like, oh no, I need to stop working because the sun has set and now I can't get light to read from. Oh, we can solve that by indoor lighting. But then you have things like, okay, I need to sleep at some point. Okay, I want to overcome that thing too. But I think in general, being able to expand that and being flexible about our limits, and then we can set them as we decide, is so valuable and so good.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a kind of liberty project of removing arbitrary limitations to us, and it's
whatever we think about death, I think it's quite agreeable that aging makes the body deteriorate. And that's something we should fight against.
It's a bad kind of limitation. It's one thing that maybe life will eventually end, and I think it's kind of hard to avoid in a world that actually has entropy and quantum mechanics and a random accident. But one should make sure that probability is low, and we should be able to decide how much time we have. It's a bit like in ethics, we quite often regard autonomy as, yeah, I can set up my own limits. I can decide what to do and what not to do, but it's me who decides those rules, not somebody else just forcing my hand.
So you have, or at least you used to have, a cryonics contract. You still have it?
Oh yeah, I'm signed up at Alcor.
Yeah. How does this square with what you were saying before about Anders not continuing to live?
Well, I think, again, just like I argued that it's a good thing that there is an Anders-like person waking up tomorrow morning, if I'm dying, I might want an Anders-like person to wake up maybe 100 years in the future. That's just a slightly longer time interval. So I still regard this as very much like keeping myself alive in the normal way. So I think cryonics makes sense. It's a backup. Also, I quite often realize that, to me, even discussing cryonics is actually one of the great delights of life. I'm wearing my little cryonics tag very openly because as a conversation starter, it immediately gets people to start talking about the big things. I fear that quite often we end up in everyday life in conversation about very mediocre, normal stuff. And I like to get the big future involved. So many people don't like that, but the little do we know, they ask about what's that medallion about? And before they know it, we're talking about life and death, or what is the point of staying alive, and why do we trust those future generations? What have they done for us lately?
Yeah. I've signed up for with Tomorrow Bio.
Yes, keeping to the European side.
And I just, yeah, exactly. And I just got my welcome package. So I also have the jewelry now to use. So I'm looking forward to those discussions.
Yeah, it's fun.
I had this, the chip in my hand to open the door at the office. That's also a conversation starter, but I think this is going to be great.
Yeah. The chip is a little bit too discreet. You need to know what to look for.
Exactly.
Yeah, the kind of transhumanist bling, or the futurist bling, really bringing parts of the future into the present. Yeah. So books. So when I think about the books that have really kind of affected me, so one book was Olaf Stapledon's Star Maker. It's one of the great science fiction novels. It's also somewhat of a tough read because it's almost like a history book, except that it's a history of the future of humanity, and all humanity is written from a perspective of somebody in the 1930s. So, of course, he's totally wrong about the near-term history, and then a lot of the science is totally obsolete, but it's this epic story about where humanity might evolve to, what it might collapse from, and other humanities and other takes on it. It's really, really epic. Or rather, now I described his first novel, Last and First Men, because Star Maker is slightly grander, because that one is essentially about the same thing, but now about all the intelligent life in the universe. And it even covers the entire story, all 14 billion years in Last and First Men, on about half a page summary somewhere in the middle, where he discusses civilizations of this kind of type, like that humanity which did the following things. And then he keeps on going to grander and grander scales. It's one of those science fiction novels that really tries to think about how different could aliens be? How different could the universe be in the far future? What could intelligence actually do to the universe if it got really powerful? And could we create better universes? So that's one of those novels that I read at a fairly young age that really set me on course. Another book which also got me, which is a little bit similar, is actually The Anthropic Cosmological Principle by Barrow and Tipler. So Barrow is a cosmologist, and Tipler also a cosmologist, and this is about humanity's role in the universe, and it's a lot of philosophy, but also a lot of really interesting science. It's from the 1980s, so it's somewhat obsolete. And it ends with Tipler's idea about the omega point theory, that intelligence might be able to literally take over the universe and guide its collapse near the end of time. So it collapses in such a way that you can extract infinite energy and use that to run computations. So you get infinite amount of thinking and memory, and you basically can do everything conceivable. That's his omega point theory. Unfortunately, it turns out that our cosmology don't seem to allow it, but it's an amazing grand vision. So it kind of got me really started thinking on that very big scale. We can actually do physics on this. We can start thinking maybe the universe is not of this kind, but maybe there are other equally good possible future for the universe we might be able to manipulate. So as a third book, which one would I recommend? I'm very fond of Hannu Rajaniemi. He's a Finnish science fiction author, and The Quantum Thief is just such a rip-roaring, hilarious story. It's kind of a heist story about a daring gentleman thief stealing stuff in a post-human, post-singularity solar system. It's the first part of a trilogy. I think it's the brightest and best part, but the rest of the trilogy is pretty awesome. And the funny thing is, of course, Hannu is also running a biotech startup now, working on also actually cancer therapies and actually thinking about immune computer interfaces. Why just think about a brain-computer interface when maybe we want to link our immune system to a computer and get the advantage of that? Both from a health perspective, but of course we need to think about the safety, because you don't want anybody to hack your immune system. So it's full of really thought-provoking and great ideas.
And what's a big thing that you're going to do this year?
So this year I'm working on trying to make the sequel of my old roadmap on brain emulation. So I made one together with Nick Bostrom back in 2008, and a lot of things have happened in neuroscience and computer science since then. So it's really time to make a new one. And the cool part is there are several competing projects working on this. So there is one I'm involved in involving carboncopies.org, which is kind of trying to make one roadmap. And then there is a renegade roadmap where some students over at Ed Boyden's lab at MIT are also hammering out. And then there is a company I'm somewhat involved in, which is a bit under wrap, that is thinking about, could you actually make money from this? And next week I'm running a workshop about the ethics of brain emulation, and I'm trying to be a diplomat and tie these projects together. So at the end of the year we have this idea about where, if we want to go in a world of simulated humans, what do we need to do? What science do we need to work on? What experiments do we need to deal with? What philosophical conundrums do we maybe have to resolve and think about in order to do it in the right way? So that's kind of my big project this year. Besides, of course, finishing my book about law, liberty and Leviathan, which is about social systems and AI, and restarting my work on my really grand book about grand futures.
Fantastic. It's been a real pleasure and a great honor to have you here.
Well, it's been a delight, and see you in the future.